Hello. Syria's new administration has shown its first major sign of unity after armed factions reached an agreement to disband. Its leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, says the groups across the country will form one army under the Ministry of Defense. They all gathered at a special meeting in Damascus on Sunday to discuss the proposal. But the Kurdish-led and US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces is not part of the deal. The armed group has been in conflict with the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army in northeastern Syria. Meanwhile, Christians have been holding mass and celebrations in parts of Syria ahead of Christmas Day. The new administration has promised that minority groups will be protected in the country. Resul Serdar is joining us now from Damascus to discuss that agreement on the factions. Resul, I suppose the devil will be in the details, but what more are you learning about it?
Well, since the fall of Bashar al-Assad, perhaps this is the most significant development in the country. Now that all the military factions who have been, some of them fighting for over the course of 13 years of the civil war against the Syrian regime here, now deciding to dissolve themselves, to hand over their arms to the new administration is quite significant, because many of these groups have been having control of some territories for years and years. And now on December 8th, when they took over the country, so the main concern was now that they do not have a common enemy, which was Bashar al-Assad regime. Well, will they be able still to be united, to keep their unity or not? And so since then, there have been several talks, meetings after meetings in Damascus and in some other major cities. And today, finally, they all came here and they have agreed to dissolve themselves, to hand over their weapons, to come to be merged in one army that's going to be under the responsibility of the Ministry of Defense. However, whether the leaders of these armed factions are going to have some military ranks in the new military or not, that is still not elaborated. But one of the sticking points is that, Tareen, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is mainly made up to the Kurdish fighters, which is USA's main ally in Syria, is not in this deal. So, and the de facto leader of Syria, Ahmed al-Sharaa, has made it clear several times, saying that in Syria, in New Syria, there will be only Syrian army, the new army, allowed to have weapons. None of the other groups are going to be allowed to have weapons. So now that SDF is not in these agreements, is not hand over in its weapons, it's not clear what's going to be the position of the United States, which is their main backer, and what will be the response of the central governments. However, we know that still there are talks and communication channels between the Damascus and these SDF. But the question is, eventually, if SDF does not hand over its weapons, whether there will be another civil war between the central government that's not now led by the opposition and between the Kurdish fighters in northeast of the country.
Okay, Resul Serdar reporting from Damascus in Syria. Thank you. So here's a look at the groups that are part of this new deal. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It plays a central role in Syria's new administration after leading the offensive that toppled the Assad government. There's the Syrian National Army, backed by Turkey. This group operates mainly in the north and has a lot of influence in Turkish-controlled areas. The Free Syrian Army, backed by the US, this group is based in Tanaf and operates in the Syrian desert. The 8th Brigade of the 5th Corps is made up of a group of ex-rebels in southern Syria working in collaboration with Russia. The Syrian Front is a coalition of moderate opposition groups united to oppose what they consider extremist factions. Jaish al-Islam once controlled eastern Ghouta near Damascus. It's known for its strict ideology and military strength. But not everyone is on board, as you've been hearing. The Kurdish-led and US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, which control eastern Syria, have not joined this deal. Geist Pinfold is lecturer in peace and security at Durham University, joining us from Durham in the UK. Thanks for your time again. Now that the SDF is not joining this deal, as far as we know, up until this point, what are the implications of that?
Well, I think this deal is actually an attempt to put pressure on the SDF. Now, we often speak of the SDF as a Kurdish group. That's not technically true. They are a Kurdish-dominated group, but there are actually more Arab fighters, for example, in the SDF than there are Kurdish fighters. Turkey's main issue is not with the SDF per se, but with the YPG, a different subdivision of the SDF, which they see as basically the same thing as the PKK, which they consider, of course, a terrorist organization. So I think this is an attempt to get defections from particularly those Arab units within the SDF. Now, remember that towns such as Manbij and Deir al-Zor, those were formerly SDF affiliated, but they flipped, not because of particular fighting or offensive, but mainly because the Arab SDF affiliated groups there switched and pledged their loyalty to HDS. So I think this is an attempt to cut down the SDF's territory without actually officially or practically going to war against the SDF. And on the other hand, it's also important for Syria because it needs to actually have one army representing many different ethnic groups, religious groups, and interests. The devil, as you say, is very much in the detail because we'll have to see exactly how and to what extent these groups will be integrated, whether HTS can do it without actually creating so much tension and bureaucratic basically resistance that these groups will resist that challenge, but at the same time not being so hands-off that these groups remain autonomous.
Do you believe that HTS can exert its authority and influence over the various groups?
To a degree, it can, but it's mainly trading at the moment in goodwill rather than military strength. HDS is a group with around 20,000 to 30,000 fighters. 20 to 30,000 fighters, sorry. It is not the largest rebel group in Syria by far. And if you look at some of these groups, for example, the SNA, the Syrian National Army, we talk of that group as one organization. It's not. It's made up of over 40 different groups, many of whom have fought each other. They represent different religions, ethnicities. Some are jihadists, some are secular, for example, and they don't get on at the moment. The only thing they have in common is that when Turkey says jump, they say how high. So the question is, how can they be integrated? Can it be done in a way where these groups are split up and spread out? Or will they be kept under the same command structures, but reporting to a different line manager, i.e. HDS in Damascus, rather than, for example, Turkey? That's the big question. I think there has to be a nice and neat balancing act here, because if HDS goes too far one way, they'll lose that group's support. If it goes too far the other way, that group will be too autonomous and not really actually part of the defense ministry, only in a nominal way, but not a practical way.
Is there a comparison to be made here with other countries that have tried this in the past? I mean, Iraq, for example, comes to mind.
Yeah, Syria's neighbours are the obvious examples, right? You have Lebanon next door, you have Iraq. Both of those have integrated all of their various militias with varying degrees of success, I think we should say. In Lebanon, there is one army. The civil war ended in 1990, but there are very many different militias that differ by sect and ideology. For example, some groups like the Shiites have multiple militias that don't always get along with each other. So I think you can say integration in Lebanon has largely failed. And as a result, Lebanon is a weak state. It's prone to civil war. It's prone to external involvement. That's something that Syria doesn't want. Look at Iraq. I'd say it's arguably more successful in that the many militias that were operating in the country have been integrated into the state, but there's still questions as to how loyal they actually are to the state. Remember, when the Assad regime was collapsing, we had several hundred Iraqi militia fighters cross into Syria. That was without the Iraqi government's official sanction, and indeed, in the end, Iraq actually closed its border to them. So it's still not an exact science. It needs to be done in a way that creates a unified command, but doesn't create so much bureaucratic resistance that these groups go rogue.
Just a final thought from you, if I may, on the situation with ISIL in Syria. So the U.S., as we've seen recently, stepping up attacks on ISIL groups. How do you think the U.S. is going to deal with the sort of changing politics of Syria going forward? As we know, there are now 2,000 U.S. troops still in the country.
Yes, and in fact, the US killed 2 ISIL fighters last night in a strike, which I believe is the 4th strike they've targeted ISIL fighters since the fall of the regime. So not very long ago, they've definitely stepped up their activities there. What the US has been trying to do is to negotiate a ceasefire or a long-term agreement between the SDF and Turkey and its various proxy forces. They have managed to de-escalate some of the violence. For example, they convinced the SDF to basically give up some large towns and cities in exchange for the SNA pulling back as well. But the offensive never really ended. The SNA was still attacking, probably on Turkey's orders. So the US is not going to throw its weight behind the SDF. It's not going to increase those troop numbers. But the question is whether it will withdraw them. Now, predicting what Trump does, very much a fool's errand, as we know from his previous administration. But we do know that he pulled out troops last time. OK, that's what he did. But in response, Turkey escalated against the SDF, and this incensed and enraged Trump, who then backtracked on the decision. So the key here is not relations between the US and Damascus, more the relations between the US and Turkey, and whether Erdogan can sweet talk and charm Trump into once again withdrawing US forces from Syria, and whether Erdogan doesn't overplay his hand and basically create such a backlash in the Pentagon in DC that Trump reverses the decision.
Okay, Rob Geist Pinfold, lecturer in peace and security at Durham University, speaking to us from the UK. Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.